Trials of Rothgar, Episode 5, Thorns and Daggers. Skamous looked up from the scroll at his two companions. Elizabeth, a young pale elven woman, had her face screwed up in an expression of deep thought and worry. His other companion, on the other hand, looked quite the opposite. Thalis, a tall human dressed in black leathers that were laden with daggers, wore a look that could only be described and interpreted as delighted. Sounds to me like we've got a challenge ahead of us, but it seems like they've got high hopes for us. Thalis tapped a scroll that sat on the table, indicating the lines where they were being praised for the way they had worked so far. Elizabeth chuffed as she slowly shook her head from side to side. Hope is good and all, but I don't think it'll stop a dragon from cooking us to ash for encroaching on its territory, nor will it stop a group of giants from crushing us to paste. Thalis blew out a breath. Well, you got me there. But how hard could it be to deal with an old hermit? Quick in and out. If we leave now, we could be back before breakfast. Skamous smiled at the two, who never seemed to stop arguing. When they had first started working together, they were constantly at each other's throats. Now, though, their chitter-chatter of the two was light-hearted, and both seemed to enjoy the presence of the other. Hags are not just old hermits. They're dangerous arcane women of the Fae. I've only read a little about them, but apparently there are many types, and some of which steal and eat children. Well, good thing we're all grown, and you're not pregnant, unless there's something you're not telling us, Thalis said with a chuckle. Elizabeth socked him in the shoulder, her face red with anger and embarrassment. Skamous raised a hand, cutting them off before they could continue their banter. I actually know quite a bit about hags. Part of my training with Drem consisted of various forms of studying mythology and lore of creatures I would encounter while working for the Order. Both Thalis and Elizabeth smiled at this, excited at having a little bit of information on the creature they might be facing. Neither one of them liked the idea of dealing with creatures large enough to use their bones as toothpicks. Well, what I remember is a bit rusty, but there are several types of hags, each with unique powers and abilities that are not fully known. What is known, if my memory serves me well, is that they are the masters of illusion, and are very tricky. It is quite common for them to make deals, so that is one thing we have in our favor, though Dram had always said that their deals caused more chaos than they were worth. Thalis shrugged. Still prefer it to Dragon's Fire. Elizabeth bobbed her head agreeingly. Yes, and I'm surrounded by enough testosterone with Thalis around without adding giants to the mix. So it's settled then. We're going after the hag. Any chance your old instructor might know where we might find one? Skamous' face fell, thinking of Dram's sudden departure. No, but I think the journal that contained the information on them may still be at his home. Well, what are we waiting for then? Elizabeth said, standing from the picnic table. The three of them made their way further from the center of town, meandering through the streets until they found themselves in front of Skamous' old training grounds. Stepping past weathered old archery targets and beat-up-looking training dummies, they made their way into the silent abode. For Skamous, the quiet was unsettling. Previously, whenever he had come to visit his old master, a fire would be roaring, and more often than not, music would be playing throughout the house. Skamous led his companions through the entry room and narrow hallways until they were in a room which sported several shelves upon shelves worth of books, journals, maps, and artistic depictions of all sorts of creatures, fighting styles, and battles. Elizabeth sucked in a breath. I could spend ages in here. Skamous nodded his head. Memories of countless hours spent studying the handwritten journals and listening to Dram's retelling of numerous adventures, many of which contained snippets of information about his father. Running his hand along the spines of the leather-bound journals, Skamous reveled in the feeling they produced. Eventually, Skamous selected from one of them off of a high shelf, bringing the heavy tome down to rest on the large oaken table in the center of the room. He flipped through the crisp, dust-coated pages, until he settled upon one that depicted a large cabinesque home, standing on two stilted chicken legs. Under this was the large bold words, "Mother Magdala, the Baba Yaga of the Wood." The paragraphs that followed described a member of the Order of Ashes who quite accidentally stumbled upon the home of the Fey woman. When he had turned to leave, it seemed that the very path behind him had disappeared, and the copse of trees were now so thick that they were all but impassable. Shrill cackling laughter thundered throughout the small clearing around the bipedal dwelling. One enormous taloned chicken leg extended toward and slammed down mere feet from the soldier. An echoing voice called out he had one chance for survival. "Cut the left ear from your head and place it down at your feet. If you do this, I will let you live. If not," the voice called out, "you will lose much more than hunk of flesh and cartilage." The man, a veteran to the unseen and the horrendous, was horrified by the foul magic he witnessed before him. Hesitating little, he used his dagger to do as he was told. When the flesh of the ear touched the messy, mossy earth, a sound of cracking and popping came from the woods behind him. Whirling around, dagger at the ready, he expected to see some sort of monster bounding toward him out of the woods. Instead, he saw the path had opened back up, allowing him to beat a hasty retreat. In the years after, the man reported several instances of hearing a crackling woman's voice speaking directly to him on the side of his head, which now only held a savage hole. Below this account, a small grouping of coordinates were written, indicating where the encounter took place. After the trio had read the account, they glanced at one another, worry written plain across their features. Even Thalis, who always seemed to be joking in any situation, seemed put off by what they had just read. And he had just stumbled across her, and was supposed to make a deal? "No," Skamous said. "You don't just stumble across creatures like a hag. Dram used to say that they could influence the creatures and the very nature that surrounds them. It's more than likely that she needed the ear for some kind of alchemy or magic, and she used the magic to lure him toward her in one way or another." Thalis was chewing his lower lip. "So, what then? We just head to the coordinates and hope that we can strike a deal before we end up in her cooking pot?" Skamous once again shook his head. "Chances are she might want something from us, and if we're lucky we can offer our services in exchange for hers. Regardless, we won't know until we get there." Going to the shelves again, pulling down a small map, he unfurled it. The map showed the huge walled city of Rothgar and the surrounding wilderness. Mountains were to the north, the area the dragon would most likely be. The Lucidian oceans were to the west. A large red X reading giant camps was near the coasts. The whispering woods were to the east, and to the south was a mixture of woods and swampland. It was there where the coordinates indicated that they would be going. After notating this, Skamous packed away the map and the book to take with them, then headed to a small supply room Drem had always kept, most of which had been used for training, but would hold up just fine in real situations. Slowly, Skamous began packing bags for them, taking time to even mix a few herbs together that, when applied to the skin, made you undesirable to insects, a salve that he had wished he would have had during their trip into the woods. Once they were all packed, they sat down for a small meal. Elizabeth was the first to break the silence. "You are sure that Dram won't mind us taking all these supplies?" In between bites, Skamous explained how Dram had left the house for him, not going into detail on where his instructor had gone, as he truthfully didn't know. After the meal, they all found somewhere to sleep, agreeing that they would leave at first light. Skamous awoke in the middle of the night to a small click, which echoed throughout the empty night air. The sound itself was not loud, but in the stillness of the house, it might as well have been a gunshot. Sitting up from the cot he had erected in the middle of the living room, he followed the sound through the house until he came upon the open chest that wasn't a chest at all. Instantly, Skamous was fully awake. He quickly descended the ladder that resided within the false chest. Once down, he saw that it was not Dram in the expansive cavern as he had hoped, but Thalis. In his hand he held the key that Dram had left him. Upon seeing Skamous, Thalis blanched, a sheepish grin plainly on his face. I'm sorry. I saw the chest and I just couldn't help myself. I didn't plan on stealing anything, I just wanted to know what was inside, you know? I never expected something like this. As he said this, his eyes glanced around the cavernous space, landing on the small alcove Dram had opened upon their first visit. It held barrels, a small weapon rack, and a few training dummies and training targets. Skamous ran his hand through his hair, not truly mad, but also not happy with the invasion of privacy. You know you could have just asked. We're a team after all. I don't mind sharing, but I do mind you picking my pocket, Skamous said, holding his hand out for a key. Thalis rubbed the back of his neck, the red of his face obvious in the light of the lanterns that lit the space. He handed the key to Skamous, while his eyes still played across the space around them. So, what is this place? Some sort of tunnel system? Skamous shrugged. I'm not quite sure. Dram only brought me down here once. When he did, it was to give me my staff. He warned me not to wander too much, saying that it's easy to get lost down here. I will say, though, the libations down here are not too bad. Saying this, Skamous pulled down a pair of dusty cups, and in a move very similar to that of his instructors, he poured a drink for the two of them. Thalis chuckled, looking down at the grime that swirled within the liquid. He toasted his mug with Skamous, and the two quaffed the liquid. Skamous coughed hard, not used to the strong alcohol. While he was getting his breathing under control, Thalis wandered over to the weapon rack and pulled a black leather belt that held two ornate daggers. Each of the two blades had a shiny emerald embedded into their pommel. Thalis pulled one of the blades from its sheath, tested its weight, and flung it into one of the moldy targets. Thalis then smiled at his handiwork as the blade sunk to its hilt in the moldy straw. He nearly dropped the belt in surprise when, in a flash of green light, the dagger disappeared from the dummy's chest and reappeared in the sheath. Thalis's eyes went wide, and he looked towards Skamous, a look of awe in his pleading eyes. Skamous bit his lip, wondering what his instructor would say in a situation like this. This train of thought eventually led him back to the note, and with a start, Skamous realized the daggers were his to give. Yeah, go ahead and keep them. They could be useful. Thalis smiled warmly at Skamous. Taking the daggers from his straps, he placed them on the weapon rack. Give and take, right? I wouldn't want to leave this place without any supplies. Then he looked at Skamous. His face showed true appreciation. You know, I never had friends like this before. This gift means a lot. Thank you. And I am really sorry I didn't ask you first. You've been good to me so far. I should have trusted you. Skamous waved him off. What are friends for? Now, let's get upstairs and get some rest. We got a long day ahead of us. The two ascended the ladder, and Skamous clicked the chest back into place. When the trio awoke the following morning, they ate a hasty breakfast and set out on their way. They weren't more than a mile away from the walls of Rothgar, when the scenery around them began to shift from the lush woodlands to a boggy marsh that the trees were no longer the beautiful green of oaks, but were the dark, foreboding black of ebony trees. The air stank of bubbling sulfur, and every movement in the distance made them jump. Keeping their guard up, they made their way deeper into the swamp, making sure to regularly apply the salve Skamous had prepared the day earlier. It was this foresight that kept them safe, as the fist-sized mosquitoes that buzzed around the putrid environment avoided them entirely. At one point, they stumbled across a whitetail, laying down with 3 insects, pulling the remains of the blood from its now shriveled frame. Gently sidestepping around the grisly scene, they continued forward, until they ran into a solid wall of thorns. Elizabeth, looking at this, pulled out her spellbook from its holster and flipped through the pages. Eventually, she rifled through her component pouch and pulled out a small crumpled leaf. Blowing on it, and whispering a few arcane words, the leaf crumpled, and a patch of the thorns parted slightly. "I should be able to push us a path through, at least a little at a time. Come on." She stepped forward, the path opening more as she progressed forward. They gathered in a close circle around her, and as they moved forward, the path behind them closed off, almost as soon as they stepped beyond it. They continued this way, until all at once Elizabeth fell to her knees, grasping her head. The thorns shook around them, and Thalis and Skamous had to grab her by the shoulders and haul her forward, as the vines behind them started opening and slamming shut with enough force to create a gust of wind. They pushed forward through the vines, receiving multiple punctures and lacerations as they rushed forward. The wave of thorns behind them was getting closer and closer, when finally, just as the vines were opening up to slam shut around them, they stumbled into a clearing. Elizabeth was still grasping her head and moaning in pain. Both Skamous and Thalis were bleeding heavily from taking the brunt of the thorns to get Elizabeth through. Glancing around, they were immediately greeted with a scene straight from the journal they had read. An enormous, ramshackle-looking house towered over them on stilted, bent chicken legs. It looked as though it was about to lurch toward them, and its shadow loomed over them like the cowl of death. Elizabeth slowly relaxed as whatever force had assaulted her seemed to relent. She looked up at them with wide, terror-ridden eyes. She invited us in." As soon as the words had been spoken aloud, the chicken legs bowed and the house came to rest on the ground with a slam and a creaking of wood. They all looked toward the imposing building when the door swung open of its own accord. As they stared gape-mouthed, a low, cracky female voice echoed out from within. "Well, children, don't make me ask twice." Skamous swallowed the lump in his throat, and after helping Elizabeth to her feet, they stepped through the door together, the wood of the house squealing under their feet like a branded pig. The room was low lit, with dark red candles that looked like burning scabs in the dark. The dimness that surrounded them almost made them overlook the 9 severed ears that hung from twine near each lit candle. In the center of the room, sitting on a rocking chair, was a strikingly beautiful young woman with hair as red as fire. "So, I hear," the ears twitched as she said this, "that you wish to make a deal." Skamous shuddered and Thalis stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am. We are here." Thalis was cut off as she waved a hand, and he was sent flying into a wall, the air knocked out of him. "I wasn't talking to you," She settled one beady eye on Elizabeth while the other stayed focused on Thalos, hovering in the corner. Yes, it is as you say, wise woman, Elizabeth managed to stutter out. The red-haired woman's hand dropped, and so did Thalos, gasping for breath. Fine, then. Let us bargain. Now, my dear players, it is your chance to decide. What could Mother Magdala have in store for them? Maybe a deed? She could have them find or kill something for her. Something more material, like a body part or even Skamous' magic staff? Or, the most nefarious of all, a favor, allowing her to make them at her beck and call whenever she asks. These all could lead to some very interesting outcomes. But it is your story, my players, and it is your choice to make. And if you have any other ideas, feel free to mention it in the comments section in our YouTube video. If your idea gets the most likes when we go to make our next episode, then we'll go with your suggestion. Most importantly, thank you for sticking around. We love you for it. And until next time, let's write a story. Let's play a game without the dice.